Okay, so today we're going to be talking a bit about political socialization and then move into the media, which has a huge role in how we are socialized into politics. So one of the questions that I would normally ask if we were in the classroom setting for this would be, what's your earliest political memory? When's the first time you kind of realized that politics existed? And for me, that was the election of Mike Harris in Ontario. Now I'm aging myself, but it was the first election that I remember actually seeing signs up and asking questions about what was going on. So think back and reflect on what is it the first time you kind of realized politics existed? And likely those sorts of events had an impact on how you see politics today. So today we're going to talk about political culture and political socialization. And then move into the bulk of the lecture, which will be on the mass media. And we'll focus a lot on traditional medias, and then in class look a little bit more at social media and the impact that it might have today on how we understand information. So in order to start, we need to understand what is political culture. So if we say that we are socialized into a specific political culture, then we need to know what political culture is. So the definition that we give for political culture is essentially that it's the understanding, values, attitudes, and principles of any community or society. Looking at things like how should it be organized politically? What sort of processes should there be? When there are disputes, how do we deal with that? What sort of policies do we put in place? So there's a political culture to RMC. There's a political culture to the military. There's a political culture to Kingston, to urban areas, to Ontario, to Canada, to North America. So any sort of grouping of human beings can have some sense of a political culture. You can even have a political culture in your family. You know, your family has a certain set of attitudes and beliefs about politics and about how communities should be built. And so then those beliefs and values are going to structure how citizens see politics and what their expectations are about politics and how they think government should be acting. So this is kind of a nice diagram that explains how political culture, then influenced by socialization, impacts political behaviors. And we currently have a kitty cat who is trying to, there we go, who is trying to get onto the keyboard. All right, so where does our political cultures and our political behaviors come from? So we say that there's kind of two major things that happen. So the first is certain events. So there can be defining events and repeated events. So defining events would be some sort of a shock to an existing political culture. So what would be some examples of a defining event in recent years? So for me, a defining event would definitely be, oh my gosh, kitty cat, would definitely be 9/11. So I was in grade 7 when the September 11th attacks happened, and that was definitely a defining event for me. It defined how I see the United States in terms of global politics. It impacted how I saw the Middle East and conflict in the Middle East. And then it started, of course, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and those things influenced how I see conflict in general. And even influenced how I see the Canadian military, for example, because I grew up seeing images from Afghanistan. So you might have your own defining events for your political culture. Also, a whole society can have specific defining events. So we can look back to things like Confederation or certain conflict, the conscription crisis, back in the early 1900s, where you can see how you built that political culture. There's also repeated events, so a factor that just keeps seeming to influence a country. So something like a very long war. Again, look at Afghanistan or Iraq as examples of long wars that are repeated and are constantly reinforcing certain beliefs. Or an economic downturn, so if you keep seeing, certain economic downturn like we saw in 2008, there's always that threat of it coming again, and that's going to impact how people see politics. And then, of course, there are socialization, so the transmitting of political cultures through these defining or repeated events. But then also they're coming from things like your friends, your peer groups, your school, your family. And so you can be obviously really influenced by your family and how they see politics. it's one of the best predictors of what party you're going to vote for is probably how your family votes. And we know that your family can influence how you see the world and how you see politics. So it's important to think about that question is, where do you tend to get your political information from? Where do your political beliefs come from? And then it's also worth asking yourself, where do your political beliefs differ from that of your parents? Where are they the same? So I remember growing up, my dad was a union leader, and so I remember going to picket lines, and that definitely impacted how I see unions and strikes and labor movements today is based on, that influence of my parents. But then at the same time, I also had some experiences where I shifted my political beliefs from my parents' political beliefs. So it's worth having a reflection about how these events and how you're socialized are going to build political culture together. And then that political culture is going to influence how you behave politically. So are you signing petitions? What are you signing petitions for? Are you voting? Who are you voting for? Are you donating funds to specific causes or beliefs or political parties? And who are they? And what is that? So that's that political culture is going to influence how you behave in politics. So one key piece that we haven't talked about yet, though, about how we get political information, how we are socialized, how our political culture is built, is, of course, the mass media. That's where we get a lot of our information. Sure, we get a lot of it from our friends and our family, but the mass media has a huge impact on building a specific political culture and deciding what sort of things we're going to see. So let's just start with what is the media supposed to do. So there's two main things that the media is supposed to do. The first is to inform citizens about important issues. So it's supposed to tell you, hey, there's an election going on. You should consider, here are your options, and you should consider going to vote. It can tell you, there's this particular thing going on in the world, just, heads up, or this person is missing. You should probably know about that. Stay on alert, or whatever it happens to be. And then the other thing is to uncover abuses of power. So this is kind of the old school journalism where the journalists are going out there and figuring out, where are there abuses of power that maybe the public doesn't see. So I often think about uncovering a scandal at City Hall type thing, or the movie The Spotlight, where there's an institution in society and these journalists uncovered an abuse of power happening within that particular institution within society. So that's kind of the dual purpose of the media. But they have an incredible amount of power when they are doing that. And that's through two things called agenda setting and framing. So I'll explain what both of them are, and then we'll talk a little bit about how that reinforces existing beliefs. So the first is the agenda setting. And so that's essentially when the media is going to tell us what to think about. So what is political? So it's not just saying what you see, but what is the top of the news story? That's a decision that the media has to make is regarding what is going to be leading the story. Is it going to be one issue or another issue? Are we going to be talking about this political leader or that particular issue? And so they're going to say, essentially define for us what we're going to pay attention to. And then the other issue is framing. So this idea of the way or the manner in which information is presented. So are we drawing attention to party leaders in the horse race in an election as opposed to ideologies and party positions? And so framing is essentially how they're going to show a particular issue, and that's going to serve to frame in our minds how we are then going to see a particular issue. But the thing that we often forget about is that the media is often going to be reinforcing existing beliefs rather than trying to change your mind. And a lot of that has to do with self-selection. We choose to consume the types of media that are going to frame things in a way that is palatable to us. And so we have to also remember that the media is not just always a super impartial body that is going to tell us all about politics, that it's also going to be trying to capture our attention, and therefore is going to try to show us things that are already going to reinforce what we believe. And that leads into some of the main criticisms with the media today. So we're going to go through 5 criticisms or changes or challenges. Maybe challenges might be the best word for it, to look a little bit at how we can see the media a little bit critically today. All right, so the first is a lack of independence. So you may know that a lot of newspapers, we'll just start with newspapers in Canada, are largely controlled by the same group of chains. So the Post Media Network, Sun Media, owns a lot of the major newspapers in Canada: National Post, Ottawa Citizen, Calgary Herald, etc. And so if you click on this link below, you can take a look at a video that kind of explains that, the Post Media and Sun Media merger and how that impacts the media market in Canada. Another example would be, the Irving family owning most of the media in New Brunswick. And so even smaller local newspapers then are all largely owned by the same group of chains of media. So why could that be a problem? Well, the challenge with that is that one owner or one chain could have a lot of power over what the public sees. And then even then on national opinion, because if they own so many local newspapers, they're going to be able to decide how things are framed, what agenda is being set in a large swath of the country. And so the challenge, of course, with that is that certain owners might decide what kind of issues we're talking about. They might sway the public in one side or another. If you look at the video down here, it also explains, though, that it can bolster media in the sense that local newspapers were floundering and these larger chains were able to kind of prop them up, so there's still some local newspapers. So there's pros and cons, of course, but this challenge of the lack of independence of local newspapers and even national newspapers today, because they are all owned by the same chains, is one clear challenge. Similar things happen with broadcasting. There's major broadcasters that own lots of the local broadcasters as well. So we'll talk about the CBC in a bit. Essentially, CBC and Radio Canada are the publicly funded, and they are mandated to provide Canadian content, but obviously often lacking in funds, and we'll talk about that in a second. But then you have the private media, so CTV, Global, and increasingly similar to newspapers in that one chain then owns, Global Kingston, or I remember CTV North Bay where I was growing up. So that lack of independence can be a clear challenge to the media if certain voices are always being able to define what we're going to be seeing on the news and how we see those items. The second major challenge with the media today is the fact that it can lead to some social isolation. So essentially, the type of media you see is obviously going to have an impact, and that you choose your media based on a variety of factors. So for example, media are often divided along linguistic lines. So French media versus English media, and increasingly today, lots of other language medias. So what kind of analysis you're going to get in a newspaper written in French might be very different from one thing you'll get in a newspaper written in English. And so Canada has always had some challenges in media being divided based on linguistic lines and not being able to have that whole national conversation because of that. Additionally, we talked a little bit earlier that people are going to try to consume media based on what reinforces existing beliefs. So, for example, a banker will pick up the Financial Times, whereas somebody who's more elite educated in Toronto might pick up the Walrus magazine, whereas somebody who's really into their local community, has lived in Kingston all of their life, might pick up the Whig Standard, Kingston's local newspaper. And so what you choose to see is going to reinforce those beliefs you already have, as opposed to exposing you to a variety of different beliefs. And, we often see that, especially in the United States, where you see, Republicans watching Fox News and that reinforcing their beliefs versus, a more liberal voter or a Democrat watching CNN. And so that's where we get this idea of the echo chamber, the idea that you're going to be only talking to and consuming media that's going to reinforce what you already believe, and that causes great divisions within society. And then the other issue is social media today causes that to an even larger extent. So social media, they want you to be staying on their platform, and so they're going to keep showing you things that's going to make you feel good, that's going to make you feel, oh yeah, I totally agree with this. And so you'll see recommendations from just your friend group as opposed to seeing a wide variety of different medias. And so this can lead to some social isolation based on what we choose to consume. And in the area of social media, we might not even consciously be making that choice. We're just given the sorts of stories and the sorts of news outlets that are going to reinforce our beliefs. Another issue today with the media is the dependence on ad revenues. So as you know, there's been a decline in subscription-based service. So that means that companies require ad revenues to publish. The challenge with that, though, of course, is that this means that what is talked about may be different, because if companies want ads to be on certain type of content, so, I am, a toothbrush manufacturer, and I, don't really want my story on a news story that is all about, toothbrushes are terrible or something like that. I might choose to only put my advertising on certain types of stories. And so companies then are starting to have a sway over what kind of stories are being published because of these advertisements. The other issue is the rise of infotainment. So the idea that we want to keep your eyes glued to this news story or to this television or to this site for as long as possible. So we might make things a little more sensationalized. We might make it more like entertainment so that you are going to spend more time on there. You're going to have more essentially time on the site or time watching the channel, and therefore you can get more ad revenues out of it. And so that causes this challenge of media wanting to keep us watching as long as possible, whether or not what they're providing is useful. And so you think of that like cable news channels, where they just want to keep giving you breaking news to keep you entertained, whether or not that news is actually breaking. And so that's changed how the media has to work. Related to that is the commercial changes. So obviously we know that traditional news sites are undergoing issues. There's been lots of cuts to reporting, especially in reporting budgets, with fewer people paying for news, preferring to get it online for free, for example. There's less money for reporters and more sharing around. So that means that the types of in-depth investigations that we might have had in the past can't really exist anymore because newsrooms are hit by cuts, and that causes some challenge. Are they really picking up on abuses of power if they don't have the human power to actually go out and find those things, and instead are just relying on whatever comes through the wire, whatever prepackaged stories they might get, just because they have to put something out? And then the last one relates a lot to the CBC. And the erosion of public content. And so the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, is publicly funded. To some extent, it also has ad revenues. And it was designed to overcome a lot of the previous challenges that we mentioned. So because it's publicly funded, they're less reliant on ad revenues. They would have more time for investigative journalism. They would produce more Canadian content, and content that, might not necessarily get all the ad revenues, but that could be published because or broadcast because it was Canadian and content and stuff that we saw to be a public good. So the challenge, though, is that they are facing the same sorts of financial pressures. There's a lack of public desire for funded media, especially if the private media seems to be doing it better. If I can watch it on CTV, why am I paying through my tax dollars to fund the CBC? And also there's some criticism about the distorting effect on the media market, having a publicly funded broadcaster competing against struggling private news companies for this small amount of advertising dollars. And so there's always a bit of a debate that comes up every once in a while about the CBC and whether we need that public content anymore. And if not, what would replace that? And whether private media can really provide us with the sorts of Canadian content. Would it be feasible in terms of, like, financially feasible if it weren't for this public funding? So that's a key debate that often comes up in Canadian politics regarding the CBC and public content here in Canada. So that's it for today, a quick video. We'll talk a little bit more in class about social media and new medias and how they influence Canadian politics. But for now, head on over to the quiz, fill that out, and we'll see you in class.